streets, the demonstrators are having everything their own way.
In 1979, the world was gripped by a new kind of revolution.
This is the man they call the father of the revolution, and this is the moment that millions in Iran have been waiting for.
Iran's revolution helped make Islam into a political force from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. It also transformed Iran's relations with Western countries. America became the great Satan, but for many it was Britain that aroused the most animosity. Iranians have long thought that if something goes wrong, the British must have a hand in it.
As a British writer and journalist living in Iran, I've come to appreciate Iranian culture for its wit and subtlety. I'm sitting here watching Uncle Napoleon, a much-loved television serial that was based on a novel of the same name, first published in Iran in 1973. Uncle Napoleon is essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand the unique position that Britain occupies among many Iranians. And it even sheds light on the fraught nature of political relations between the two countries.
زن سردار؟ بله. این زن انگلیسیه؟ تو خونه من؟ پس بگو خونه من شده ستاد جنگ انگلیسا! کی اینا رو تو خونه من راه داده؟
Uncle Napoleon is an old soldier who fought against the British in the First World War. Now, in 1941, when the story is set, he believes that the British want nothing more than to take their revenge on him. Uncle Napoleon sees the hidden hand of the British in every area of his life. Although the book and the TV series have been banned from time to time after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, they both remain extremely popular.
Dick Davis, a professor of Persian studies, translated the book into English.
My Uncle Napoleon is really the most popular novel ever written in Iran. It treated something which was very important to many Iranians to do with their sense of politics and their sense of history and Iran's place in the world, something that was very important to them, but which had not really been discussed or talked about openly and in a literary fashion at all. And this was the Iranian obsession, certainty that everything that had happened in Iran for the past 100 years, perhaps 150 years, had happened because somebody in England, in Whitehall, wanted it to happen.
I'm on a journey to understand relations between Iran and Britain, and this takes me to Paris to meet Uncle Napoleon's author. Iraj Pezeshzad was a diplomat until the revolution of 1979, when he went into exile.
الو سلام آقای پزشکزاد، من دو بلیگ هستم. خیلی ممنون.
حالا این تیکری که من برای شما میخوانم، قمر که به اصطلاح نوه عموی دایجانه حامله شده از آدم ناشناسی که معلوم نیست که بحث راجع به اونه. دایجان معتقده که دستور انگلیس هاست. حالا بگذاریم این تیکه. دایجان با لحن تندی گفت اسدالله خواهش میکنم شوخی رو کنار بگذار. اسدالله میرزا خندید و گفت
پس به نظر شما انگلیس ها با هر کی دشمن باشن یه گردن کلفت مأمور میکنن نوه عموشو بی‌سیرت کنه؟ مزخرف نگو، سفسطه نکن. حالا خیلی مونده تا تو از حیله های این گرگ پیر سر در بیاری. خوبه که تو وزارت خارجه کار میکنی. پس ما این حساب نوه عموی هیتلر و نوه عموی موسولینی هر کدوم تا حالا 3 شکم زاییدن.
دایجان ناپلئون عقب افتادگی خودش رو به مخالفت انگلیسان نسبت میداد. این آدم خیال بافی است و اون موقع در اون دورانی که این وقایع اتفاق میفته این فکر این که همه چیز دست انگلیس ها هست و هر اتفاقی در مملکت میفته پشت پرده انگلیس ها یه انگلی کردن یا به میل و خواسته اونا انجام شده و به اصطلاح در ذهن مردم این وجود داره که دوستی با انگلیس باعث عزت و نعمت، دشمنی با انگلیس باعث ذلت و عقب افتادگی است.
It's a wonderful book. It's beautifully written to begin with. It's very well written. It's a farce. And like many, it does what a farce does. It takes a stereotype which is rooted in reality, but it exaggerates it for comic purposes. It's a bit like, say, P.G. Wodehouse and Bertie Wooster. You know, England is not populated with Bertie Woosters. On the other hand, the caricature that Bertie Wooster is based on things which are specifically English and recognizable as English. And Uncle Napoleon is such a character. I mean, Iran is not populated by Uncle Napoleons. On the other hand, many people in Iran do have some of the characteristics of Uncle Napoleon, and particularly they have this kind of paranoia, it's not too much to call it that, about the hidden hand of the English.
Once, relations had been very good.
I'm sitting looking at this wonderful picture of Sir Robert Shirley, who was an ambassador in the beginning of the 17th century. But he wasn't an ambassador sent by Britain to Iran. He was an ambassador sent by the Iranian Shah Abbas the Great to Europe. And this picture shows Robert Shirley in this extraordinary orientally inspired costume. And I think what's really remarkable about this picture is this idea that Shirley had entered the service of the Shah willingly as a Briton. There's no sense of superiority, no sense that to enter the Shah's service would demean him. This is the time, we shouldn't forget, when Shakespeare is writing of the Great Sophie, and the Great Sophie was a reference to Shah Abbas. So it became axiomatic that Iran was splendid, it was worth admiring, it wasn't something that we felt superior to.
European visitors to Iran marvelled at the architecture and splendour of Isfahan and other cities. But the wonder and admiration waned as British power grew. By the late 19th century, Britain had the richest empire in the world, but Iran was poor, victim of two rival empires, Russia and Britain, who treated it as a buffer state and sought to extend their influence.
In England, it was seen as a place that might fall into the hands of Russia, that was weak and probably couldn't retain its own independence, though in fact it did, and had to be kept an eye on.
Short of money, the Shahs of the time granted a number of concessions to foreign companies.
Really, from the beginning of the 19th century, Britain had regarded Iran as an essential piece of real estate on the communications route to India. It was all about India, as so much of the rest of the empire was. And I think we'd got into the habit over the years, over really almost a century and a half, of regarding Iran, although an independent country, as a place where we really called the shots and somehow had a natural right to do so.
The British had had a complicated relationship with Iran throughout the 19th century, but largely saw themselves as competing against the Russians for influence in Iran in defense mainly of their empire in India. And one of the ways in which they sought to compete with the Russians was to encourage the development of how they saw it, liberal democratic ideas.
While British speculators looked to Iran's mineral wealth, some of its diplomats were helping the Iranian nationalists in their battle with the Shah for greater democracy.
انگلستان بر اثر پشتیبانیش از نهضت مشروطه خیلی محبوب شد و اوج این محبوبیت البته وقتی بود که درهای سفارت رو باز کردن و اجازه دادن عده‌ای قابل ملاحظه از سران و فعالان انقلاب مشروطه در سفارت انگلیس بست بنشین.
مردم هجوم میارند و داخل سفارت انگلیس یه چیزی مثل 12,000 نفر، شاید 14,000.
These merchants, shopkeepers and traders had little in common except their opposition to the Shah. Some wanted legal reform inspired by Western models, while religious leaders across the country wanted any reform to be defined by Islam.
اصلا چندین شب و روز مثل این 2 هفته تقریبا یا شدم 3 هفته من الان دیگه خاطرم نیست اونجا زندگی میکنن نهار شام و تجار بزرگ میدادن اینا بیشتر کسبن و اونجا تعلیم داده میشد یعنی بهشون میگفتن که شما چی تقاضا کنید و شارژ دافر انگلیس گراند داف هستش که تماس داره با اینا مذاکره میکنه وساطت میکنه بنابراین یک نقش خیلی اساسی این بست توی انقلاب مشروطه داره.
The Shah eventually backed down and allowed a parliament, but Britain's support soon gave way to political expediency, and the people's hopes for democratic reform gradually withered.
Certain changes in the relationship, in the broader relationship with Russia, meant that by 1907, their interest in the constitutional movement in Iran became subservient to their broader political and national interests with Russia. And I think that relationship took precedence, and from 1907 onwards, they basically, on an official level, lost interest in the constitutional movement and the revolution.
Finally, the English and the Russians got together in 1907, and they actually made a treaty which the Persians were not invited to attend the discussions that led up to this treaty, and they were only told of it afterwards.
The agreement divided Iran into spheres of influence, Russia to the north, Britain to the southeast, with a neutral zone in the centre. It was designed to reduce the rivalry between Britain and Russia, but many Iranians saw it differently.
وقتی که این قرارداد بین انگلیس و روسیه بسته شد و به خصوص تقسیم ایران در واقع حاکمیت ملی ایران رو 100% در مورد تردید قرار میداد و در نتیجه ملت ایران رو سخت از انگلیس ناامید و مایوس کرد.
که از انگلیس انتظار حمایت داشتن، از انتظار حمایت علیه روس‌ها.
Iran was the victim of a power struggle within Europe. Germany was expanding aggressively. A nervous France brokered an anti-German alliance involving Russia and Britain, the 1907 Anglo-Russian Agreement. I've come to Burgundy to meet a leading authority on this period. It's not often you find a Persian speaker in wine country.
سلام جناب آقای ریشخ. حالتون خوبه؟
خیلی خوشم.
خوب هستین؟ خیلی ممنون.
سفر خوش گذشت.
متشکرم.
سالها من در ایران بودم و مشغول جمع کتاب و مطالب راجع به تاریخ ایران بودم.
I asked Dr. Richard why France had supported the Anglo-Russian agreement.
چون رقابت دو تا امپراتوری روسیه و بریتانیا در آسیا خطر به هم زدن روابط دوستانه فرانسه با این دو کشور به وجود آورده بود، فرانسوی‌ها فشار آوردند تا هم روسیه هم انگلیس برای تقسیم مناطق نفوذ در آسیا، نه فقط در ایران، در افغانستان و در شمال هند یک توافقی با هم داشته باشند و دیگه رقابت دوستانه داشته باشند و منطقه به اصطلاح خنثی بین دو تا امپراتوری یا دو تا منطقه نفوذ بمونه.
خب ببینید اثر قرارداد 1907 اینه که انگلیس با وجود اینکه حمایت میکنه از مشروطه، این زمان دیگه از روسا حمایت میکنه. یعنی وقتی مجلس به توپ بسته میشه دیگه حمایت نمیکنه. وقتی که مجلس دوم رو روسا با اولتیماتوم خیلی سختشون چیز میکنن، مجلس رو وادار میکنن که بسته شه، انگلیسا باز همتی نمیکنن. یعنی اینجاست که دیگه اون شک که ایرانی ها که اینا با روسا دارن همکاری میکنن.
توی شلوغی مشروطیت با همه اون فداکاری های من خواستن آبروی منو بریزن، خواستن منو به لجن بکشن، همه جا هو انداختن. تو روزنامه های اون موقع نوشتن که من تو قضیه توپ بستن مجلس با کلونل لیاخوف همکاری داشتم. درسته من جزو فوج قزاق بودم، ولی به ارواح آقای بزرگ قسم اگر یک گلوله از تفنگ من شلیک شده بود.
in his mind, he's a fantasist. He's a kind of Don Quixote figure. In his mind, these skirmishes that he fought with these tribesmen have magnified into enormous pitched battles against the forces of imperialism, with him as a Napoleon figure.
پسرموش تو شرکت نفت انگلیس کار میکنه. بده من کاسا.
Britain's political interest in Iran would be transformed by oil.
Persia, at the turn of the century, a poor agricultural country, rich only in legend and undeveloped natural resources. After 7 years of costly and unrewarded effort, oil was struck at last and drilling commenced. The great oil company was formed.
Oil was discovered in 1908 in southern Iran. Control of the oil was in the hands of a private British company, which would eventually become British Petroleum. A pipeline was built and a huge refinery at Abadan on the Persian Gulf. But in 1914, the government took a majority share. Oil changed Iran into a strategic asset for Britain. Iranian oil would pay for Britain's war effort.
It was crucial, the move of the Royal Navy to oil, principally because it was the means, for Anglo-Persian anyway, by which they secured political support, and the means by which, if you like, oil became more overtly a strategic commodity. Because, prior to that, oil was used principally for, lighting and illumination. But the minute it was used for powering the Royal Navy, clearly the political significance of the commodity was just increased many times. And in a very tangible sense, that, of course, became, in a way, translated into the decision of Winston Churchill when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. In 1914, he championed a move for the British government to take a majority shareholding in Anglo-Persian.
Iranian oil helped Britain win the war, but Iran was ruined.
جنگ جهانی اول واقعا یه فاجعه بود برای ایران، البته خب برای تمام دنیا، ولی در ایران خیلی فاجعه بار بود. ببینید اولا ایران اعلان فوری، اعلان بی‌طرفی کرد، ولی خب هیچ کس این بی‌طرفی رو رعایت نکرد، نه روس‌ها، نه انگلیس‌ها، نه آلمان‌ها و ترک‌ها و نه خود
مجلس ایران که
خود ایرانی‌ها.
And because the British came out of the First World War rather better than the Russians did, and there was the Russian upheaval and the establishment of communism, etc., so Russia kind of retreats for a while from the international scene, and the British are seen as triumphant in Southwest Asia, where Iran is.
بنابراین ایران در واقع اشغال انگلیس هست، یعنی جنگ که پایان پیدا میکنه. ایران درست میگم همه جا تحت نفوذ انگلیسه.
At the end of the war, Britain is bankrupt. I mean, this is one of the things that we have to remember, that Britain acquires essentially an empire in the Middle East, not including Iran in this respect, but largely through other tracts of the Middle East. But what it finds is that it doesn't have the money to manage these. It's an expensive venture running an empire. So they come up with a number of ideas of how best to achieve the results they want. Lord Curzon thought that the best way to achieve this was to offer the Iranians an agreement, a treaty agreement, by which the British would come in and help them rebuild their country.
Lord Curzon was Britain's imperialist foreign secretary. He was something of an expert on Iran. His plan became known as the Anglo-Persian Agreement.
ایران یک وامی میگیره از انگلیس، ضمناً قشونش رو قراره که یه قشون متحدالشکل بشه، چون قبلا نیست و این تحت تعلیم افسرهای انگلیسی باشه و مالیه ایران رو هم بدن دست متخصصین اقتصادی که از انگلیس بیان و اداره کنن. یعنی ظاهر داستان خیلی اصلا چیز عجیبی نیست.
اصولا منم فکر میکنم که ایران احتیاج به کمک خارجی داشت و نیروی انتظامی کافی در داخل ایران نبود تا مثلا وحدت ایران رو 2 مرتبه برپا بکنن.
But Curzon rode roughshod over Iranian sentiment, and many people saw ulterior motives in the Anglo-Persian agreement.
ایرانی ها تقریبا احساس کردند که ما آلت دست یک قدرت اروپایی شدیم که میخواد فقط از منابع ما استفاده بکنه و این قرارداد و اون به رسمیت شناختن وحدت ملی و اینا یک بهانه است برای اینکه منافع اقتصادی به دست انگلیس بمونه.
ایران هم مستعمره است، نه استقلال داره و خب همین ابهام در تشدید کردن سوء ظن تأثیر داشته، برای اینکه انگلیس ها یک نوع نفوذ مرموزی دارن.
Meanwhile, Britain wanted to get its army out of Iran and hand over to Iranians. So, in time-honored fashion, it looked for a strong leader to promote. The British identified an officer in the Iranian Cossack regiment, Reza Khan. Reza Khan came to power in a bloodless coup in 1921. Historians inside and outside Iran still debate the extent to which this was an Iranian-led or a British plan. The British certainly trained the Iranian forces, but did they encourage a coup?
یک افسر انگلیسی گماشته شد که بریگاد قزاق خود نظم بده و یک مشق نظامی و اینا بده و یک آموزش نظامی بده و این نفر هنری اسمایس بود که یک کمی مرموزه به خاطر اینکه خیلی از ایرانی ها فکر میکردن که اسمایس تمام توطئه رو خودش ساخته. معلوم نیست. خود اسمایس در خاطراتش که هنوز منتشر نشده آخرش میگه که بعضیا فکر میکنن که ما انگلیس ها این کودتا رو ترتیب دادیم، ولی درست نیست. ابتکار عمل دست ایرانی ها بود.
این کارها کاملا بدون اطلاع دولت انگلیس انجام شد. دولت انگلیس هیچ اطلاعی از این حوادث نداشت و از این تصمیمات و این اتفاقات، بلکه برعکس وقتی سید ضیا بر اثر کودتا نخست وزیر شد و قرارداد 1919 رو ملغا کرد بلافاصله، لورد کرزن وزیر خارجه انگلیس فوق العاده خشمگین شد، چون این دیگه به اصطلاح کودک خودش بود و سخت نسبت بهش دلبسته بود.
قراردادم دیگه منتفیه و با یه حکومت قوی موافق انگلیس. سید ضیا اصولا همیشه با انگلیس ها رابطه دوستانه داره. به وسیله او و خب رضاخان قزاق قدرتمند ناسیونالیست و فلان، این کودتا به دست اینها اجرا بشه با حمایت انگلیس ها.
There is no doubt that while the British had a role, and they were bound to have a role because they were the only real foreign power in the country at the time with any influence, that the generation, the genesis of the coup and its application was all basically Iranian-led.
In 1925, Reza Khan crowned himself Reza Shah and established the new Pahlavi dynasty.
وقتی که مقدمات تغییر سلطنت داشت چیده میشد، هنوز مثلا طرحش به مجلس نرفته بود، ولیعهد محمد حسن میرزا، ولیعهد احمدشاه که برادر کوچکش بود، یک نماینده فرستاد به سفارت انگلیس در تهران که نظر سفارت انگلیس راجع به این چیه، راجع به این تغییر سلطنت. و سر پرسی لورن سفیر انگلیس جواب داده بود که ما نظری نداریم، ما نسبت به این قضیه بی‌طرفیم. بیشک اینها اینو تلقی کردن به اینکه نظری نداریم یعنی که ما طرفدار رضاشاهیم، رضاخانیم و باید سلطنت رو سقوط کنیم.
Reza Shah rebranded the country as Iran instead of Persia and tried to create an independent nation. But in 1932, in the midst of a world recession, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company cut the revenues due to Iran. A furious Reza Shah tore up the concession.
Cadman, who was the chief executive and chairman of BP, negotiated the agreement pretty much personally with Reza Shah. And actually, I think when he came back, he told his sort of board of directors, we had been, quote, pretty well plucked. In other words, I don't think that Anglo-Persian conceived of that agreement actually as a victory. They felt they'd given quite a lot. I mean, it was a considerable advance over what there had been before for the Iranians. I mean, they'd been sharing the profits. They'd only had 16% of the profits before then, which, I mean, is laughable by modern standards. I mean, it's just totally derisory. And they came away with a fixed royalty per ton. And certainly their revenues from oil increased quite substantially throughout the 1930s afterwards.
The Iranians had renegotiated the deal, but they were still convinced that Britain had ultimate control.
گمان من اینه که رضا شاه از عاقبت کار اندیشه کرد، یعنی که بیمناک شد که دولت انگلیس کوشش بکنه برای برانداختن سلطنتش و چون او هم مثل هموطنانش یا مثل خیلی از هموطنانش به قدرت لایزال و جادویی انگلیس اعتقاد داشت.
کلماتی که بعد از نان و آب و گوشت و این چیزا شنیدم از فارسی یاد گرفتم. موقعی زبان باز کردم شنیدم، هرچی شنیدم و نخست وزیر تازه می آمد تو خانواده مجالس و محافلی که به هر حال اونایی که من اجازه داشت خانوادگی همه نخست وزیر جدید بله مال خودشونه. این معزول می شد، انگلیس ها راضی نبودن.
خب اونا میخوان با خراب کردن اسم من انتقام شکستاشونو بگیرن. از کجا معلومه که منو سر به نیست نکنن؟ با این خبرهای جنگ که هر روز تو روزنامه ها و رادیو هست، خب مسلما دوباره به ایران لشکر کشی میکنن. منم که دیگه کاری نیستم جلوشونو بگیرم.
In World War II, the German army had almost reached Moscow. Fearing the loss of Iran's oil fields, in 1941, Russia and Britain invaded.
There was no doubt in our mind that the Germans expected to take the refinery and the oil fields intact because they never bombed it. It was a mystery why there was never any attempt to overfly the place, let alone bomb it, during the war, and it could only have been that they thought it was a plum that would drop into their laps.
By the time of the war, Reza Shah had become unpopular. His autocratic approach had alienated his people. So when Britain and Russia occupied Iran, Reza Shah abdicated and went into exile.
خودش تصمیم گرفت که استعفا بده و ایران رو ترک کنه. خیلی ها گمان میکنن که انگلیس بهش فشار آورد که این کار رو بکنه یا اولتیماتوم داد که این کار رو بکنه. اسناد و مدارک و اطلاعات موجود چنین چیزی رو نشون نمیده، چه ایرانی چه انگلیسی.
What's interesting about the whole Reza Shah period is that while the initial British ministers in Iran were very fond of Reza Shah, they saw him as the strong man to come and reform the country. It did not take very long for the British to fall out of love with Reza Shah. They didn't like him and he didn't particularly like them. They found him quite brutish, a little bit vulgar. Of course, from the Iranian side, they argued that the British would naturally go against him because he was such a nationalist. By the end of the 1930s, he was proving increasingly unpopular within Iran itself. There was a thesis developed in Britain that Reza Shah was moving towards the Nazis. Plans were put into operation to weaken the government of Reza Shah.
The BBC Persian services suddenly changed tack on the eve of the Anglo-Russian invasion of Iran and accused Reza Shah of being a bloodthirsty dictator that had to be gotten rid of.
Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza, took over from his father, and he would always blame the British for his father's downfall. With Reza Shah gone, the press and political parties flourished, including a new communist party. But Iran's relations with Britain would overshadow politics once more, and again oil would be the bone of contention.
The situation by then was Abadan was the biggest refinery anywhere in the world. There were probably about 2,500 British expatriates living there, and there were probably about 75,000 Iranians working for BP in Iran, and most of those would have been at Abadan. So it's a pretty sizable community.
Abadan, a modern township of tidy streets and roomy houses. English-looking houses with neat gardens and spacious lawns.
The company did everything. It maintained the housing, it fed us, it looked after our health, it looked after the water supply, the hygiene, everything. Everything that we depended upon came from the company.
Rugby football was not forgotten, and though it was many miles from Twickenham, the rules were just as strictly observed.
It was said that if you could get together an interest group, the company would provide the facilities. They were marvellous in the way they looked after us from that point of view. Golf clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, tennis courts, squash courts. If you wanted it, the company would provide it.
But conditions for the Iranians, who made up the majority of the workforce, weren't so salubrious. Even the best educated were kept in junior positions.
Now, of course, in the case of this particular oil operation, I mean, you have a managerial hierarchy that quite quickly developed to run the operation, and that was a necessity to run the operation. But of course, the more senior positions were held by Brits. So actually, the notion of sort of inferiority, if there is one, towards, say, Iranians or Persians, is sort of reinforced by the fact that actually in the workplace, they occupy the more junior positions.
The Iranians were increasingly resentful of British arrogance. And now the Russians too were demanding oil concessions.
شوروی از ایران تقاضا کرده بود که در 5 استان شمالیش بهشون امتیاز نفت شمال داده بشه، معادل یعنی نوعی تعادل با امتیاز نفت جنوب که انگلیس‌ها داشتن. و یادتون باشه که اون موقع شوروی هنوز ارتشش در ایران بود.
Now, Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist and a veteran of the constitutional revolution of 40 years before, returned to parliament.
ولی مصدق به خصوص در مجلس یک رول مهمی بازی کرد برای جلوگیری از این، به این معنا که یک طرح در مجلس به سرعت گذروند که مطابق اون طرح دولت ایران حق نداشت بدون تصویب مجلس هیچ گونه امتیازی به هیچ قدرت خارجی بده.
With oil dominating the political agenda, attention shifted to Britain's oil concession, with Mossadegh leading the opposition.
دکتر مصدق اینطوری بگیم، دکتر مصدق خواستار آزادی و استقلال ایران بود. به همین علت هم وقتی که می‌بینید ایشون رئیس کمیسیون نفته، قانون اصل ملی شدن نفت رو ایشون تحت عنوان به نام سعادت ایران تنظیم میکنه و ارائه میکنه به مجلس. میخواست این سلطه‌ای رو که استعمار بریتانیا در ایران و در خیلی کشورها برقرار کرده این از بین بره. ایرانی بود و میخواست به عنوان یک ایرانی عمل بکنه.
In 1951, Mossadegh became prime minister. The bill was passed and Iranian oil was nationalized, to great public acclaim. It was a seismic event in relations between Britain and Iran. The oil company retaliated by closing the refinery at Abadan.
It was just taken pretty much for granted that the oil was owned by the company. So, yes, I think each side...
Is that because they felt that they'd spent so much money and time and effort in order to discover, exploit and market it, that they felt that entitled them to ownership?
We've developed their oil industry. They couldn't have done it for themselves. That would have been BP's view, and probably actually would have been true.
As the deadlock remains unsolved, the refinery's output is cut by half. All supplies to ships have now ceased, and the last 2 tankers left Abadan during the weekend.
We tried to explain, look, if you expropriate this and send all the British technicians away, how are you going to earn your money? You can't eat the oil. Oil has to be marketed in order to get your money, and here are the tankers, and unfortunately they are tankers belonging to the big oil companies, so we have to have some agreement. No, he wouldn't understand that. Only interested in one thing, out.
The British airlift from Abadan came to a temporary halt at London Airport last weekend. Back to Britain came the last group of women and children from the Persian oil fields. The families of Anglo-Iranian employees, their arrival meant that more than 1,000 people, including many young babies, have now been brought back in special charter planes.
Oil was incredibly important to the balance of payments. Abadan was Britain's biggest foreign asset. So for the British government, as opposed to BP, there is a huge economic concern about the importance of oil. and a huge feeling that if the leader of a Middle East country is seen to just get away with nationalizing this massive British asset, what's to stop other leaders doing the same thing?
مسئله دکتر مصدق این بودش که به هدف سیاسی توأم با هدف اقتصادی جلو بره و مهمترین اون این است که اقتصادمون رو طوری تنظیم بکنیم که اگه لازم شد بدون درآمد نفت بتوانیم سالها زندگی بکنیم تا به اون نتیجه نهایی که می‌خوایم برسیم.
The British repeatedly tried to undermine Mossadegh, painting him as a communist. But his popularity endured and he came out stronger than ever.
The 16th Independent Parachute Brigade, alerted by the War Office, stands by for possible orders to proceed to a foreign destination.
Britain came close to military intervention, but eventually opted for diplomatic pressure.
سفارت انگلیس و مصدق در اکتبر 1952 بست به این عنوان که این سفارت مشغول بوده با دستیاری برادران رشیدیان سرلشکر زاهدی و سرلشکر حجازی که کودتا بکنه در مجلس.
1952 was for America a year of decision. A record 62 million, representing a cross-section of this broad land, streamed to the polls.
Things were about to get rougher for Mossadegh. In America, newly elected President Eisenhower took a hard line against the communist threat. The same month, British officials flew to Washington.
We went there, really, I would have said, to persuade the Americans at that stage that we weren't going to get anywhere with Mossadegh and that his remaining in power was very dangerous to both our interests, and also to tell them a little bit about the means we had at our disposal for changing the government. And we felt, after we'd been talking for some time, that they accepted that Mossadegh remaining in power would eventually lead to a communist takeover.
It was my feeling then, it remains my feeling, that the British understood the extent of paranoia in this country concerning communism. This was the day of Joe McCarthy, and that the British consciously played on that fear in order to help persuade us to involve ourselves in the coup.
The British plan was to get the Shah to sack Mossadegh and install a general, Fazlullah Zahedi, in his place. Despite Mossadegh's continuing popular support, the coup plotters managed to bring him down after a failed first attempt.
من خودم روز کودتا در تهران بودم و دیدم اون جمعیتی رو که آمدند و منزل دکتر مصدق پدر بزرگ من رو غارت کردند. من غارتگرا دیدم تو خیابون با اموالی رو که دزدیده بودن از اونجا فرار می‌کردن.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob. It had no ideology. And that mob was paid for by American dollars. And the amount of money that was used it has to have been very large.
اینها در جمعشون 1000 نفر هم نمی‌شدند. در مقابل اون هزار نفری که در خانه‌های خودشون ملول بودن از اتفاقی که افتاده بود و ارتباط نداشتن که چه باید بکنن، از فرداش هم چنگال کودتا بسیار 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 قوی بود.
I'm on my way to meet another key witness to the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. General Zahedi's son, himself a former Iranian foreign minister, now lives in Switzerland.
آقای زاهدی de Bellaigue هستم.
خوشحالم. خوش آمدید. متشکرم. بالاخره رسیدید اینجا.
بله، الحمدلله.
خوش آمدید. بفرمایید تمنا
خیلی
می‌کنم.
ممنون.
رسیدم. باید بیاد داشته باشید که در این پریود مردم دنبال شخصیتی بودن اسمش فضلالله زاهدی بود. بنابراین اگر یک شخصیتی نبود، دولت خارجی هم مثل امریکا و انگلیس اون وقت دو موضوع براشون مهم بود. یکی این که ایران کمونیست نشه دیگر اینکه نفت ایران داشته باشه. این جریانات عده‌ای زاهدی رو میخواستند که بیاد نخست وزیر بشه. فرض بکنیم که اون روز اینها کودتا کردن، به قول شما. من میگم رستاخیز.
اینکه مردم قیام کردن و دیگران دخالتی نداشتن خلاف واقعه و چنان که من اشاره کردم ما الان گذشته از خاطرات مامورین CIA مثل روزولت، کیم روزولت که داستان شهر زده توش، تاریخچه داخلی خود CIA رو درباره چگونگی کودتای 28 مرداد از ابتدا تا انتها در دست داریم که در اینترنت هست و همه میتونن بهش دسترسی داشته باشن.
پس تمام این حرفای CIA ها دروغه؟
بعد از این بسیار دروغه.
چرا دروغه؟
برای این خاطر چطور خودشون بعد مدارک بیرون نمیدن. هر وقت کتاب ها آمده مراجعه کرد میگن ما اینا سوزوندیم در همین کتابت
کاری که تاریخ رسمی CIA اومد بیرون
هیچ
دیگه.
هم چیزی نیست. یا شما نخوندید یا من اشتباه. تاریخ رسمی CIA اینه نداره. تاریخ رسمی مال وزارت خارجه 28 مرداد اونی که نوشته شده 2 نفرن. یه انگلیسی نامی است بوتاس، یک دیگری هم هست به اسم روزولت.
با شرکت در این کودتا ببینید خارجی که در این کودتا شرکت داره خیلی رک و راست و مشخص میگه ما در ایران کودتا کردیم، کمان که میبینید که وزیر خارجه امریکا به یه صورتی هم عذرخواهی کرد از ملت ایران.
1953 was a turning point in British political influence over Iran. The coup left oil divided mainly between American and British companies, with a 50% share of the profits going to Iran. Mohammad Reza Shah gradually took power solely for himself.
You see many famous people waiting here, of course. You recognize at once the Prime Minister, Mr. Butler. SI hanging on the curtains for Shah of Iran.
In May 1959, his visit was treated as a state occasion and broadcast live on the BBC.
Queen, royal family walk forward to greet the Shah, who leaves the train wearing a splendid uniform encrusted with gold. The Queen presents her dignitaries.
The Jordanian pipe band lent by King Hussein rendered Cock of the North at Gulistan Palace on the morning of the Shah's 42nd birthday.
Oil revenues had resulted in a dramatic expansion of Iran's economy. And in 1973, the Shah, as the head of the oil-producing nations, doubled the world price of oil. For Britain, it was a problem and an opportunity.
It was important to us because the oil price rise had taken place in 73. In order to offset the revenues that we were going to put out in order to purchase oil, and a lot of it Iranian oil, we needed offset arrangements. And he was ready and wanted to buy British military equipment in particular, but actually other things. So we were in the market for trying to sell the maximum amount that we could to him. And we, particularly important, to sell him tanks.
Trade took over from politics as the Shah used his oil revenues to buy British technology. The expectations of Iranians were increasing as the country modernized, and the gap between rich and poor was growing. Iran's religious traditions were being ignored. The Shah couldn't tolerate opposition of any kind, and his only answer was repression. The West became nervous about their rich friend.
The Shah by then was pretty autocratic. He had had his way substantially since the oil price rise in 1973. I became Foreign Secretary in 77 and saw him that year in Tehran. And I had a good dialogue with him and was even able to raise the treatment of prisoners and the need to have independent inspection from the Red Cross or Amnesty, and didn't provoke an outcry from him.
But nevertheless, he was hypersensitive of any criticism, and he was reluctant to take advice, and you knew that. So you had to handle him within those constraints.
You seem to think that we're very lazy in the West.
I don't think I see.
You know?
I know.
Do you see this as the besetting sin of Western industrial civilization, that people don't work hard enough?
They don't work hard enough. You talk too much about your so-called democracy, accusing other people of not being democratic. You write too much and you work not enough.
The relations on the whole were very cordial, very friendly, and very good. This is, of course, on the government-to-government basis. But, of course, there was another side to this whole relationship, and that was represented by sectors of the press. And, of course, there was the almighty BBC. To the Shah's mind, it was hypercritical, it was tendentious, and it lacked objectivity.
The World Service in particular became a source of friction.
The BBC, I think, was really quite popular because it broadcast news which Radio Iran wouldn't, and therefore it had far greater credibility.
The relation between Iranian listeners and BBC Persian service has been some sort of love-hate relationship. They expected foreign radio broadcasts to reflect what they felt was the truth.
The BBC covered the discontent extensively on both radio and television. The Shah told his ambassador to take action.
The Shah essentially wanted to suppress the BBC, particularly the BBC Persian services.
I remember only too well the endless representations I got from the Iranian ambassador. Now, on this issue, I was very tough.
David Owen, of course, for whom I had a great deal of sympathy, and do still, though I haven't seen him for a very long time, said that I agree with every word that you say, Foreign Minister, but the BBC is independent and there's nothing I can do about it.
I explained to him time after time that though the Foreign Office, on its budget, funded part of the British overseas broadcasting, we did not control their policy.
Hearing this from the Foreign Secretary was sufficient for Iran's ambassador, and he sent a telegram back to Iran.
By the standards of those days and my position in London, even though I say it myself, I think it was rather an audacious telegram, in which I said that we would be better advised to simply ignore the contents of foreign broadcasts as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, and that if the fate of the Iranian monarchy depends on a 5-minute or a 10-minute commentary by the BBC, we might as well pack up our bags and go.
One man provoked particular passion on both sides.
They were very unhappy about our even mentioning the name of Khomeini when he was in France. The reporting of what he said, and we had to report what he said, of course, in reaction to events in Iran. The reporting of what he said was strongly resented in Tehran, very strongly. But inevitably we had to report it. It was part of the general picture.
The BBC, of course, maintained, I think the phrase that they used was that in the political equation of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini was then a valid player.
He was a very prominent figure, and what he said constituted news and had to be broadcast.
It was inconceivable for the Shah, and for that matter for the great majority of the Iranian people, to accept the fact that you could have the broadcasting authority of a government who was broadcasting views not necessarily in accord with the views of the government of the day.
The Iranian radio and television went on a strike for some time, and that gave even more prominence to Persian broadcasts from the BBC.
The strike became the subject of a famous Iranian cartoon.
The stakes were enormously high. It was a question of the Shah's, the survival of his regime.
I could do something, and he knew I could do something. I could have interfered with the BBC. I hoped the BBC would have sent me packing and told me to mind my own business, and I believe that they would have done.
David Owen was very critical of us, actually, largely because he saw things through his own perspective and found the rows which occasionally erupted difficult to cope with, and therefore he took it out on us. And I remember one particular occasion when there was a lunch at Bush House of the Board of Governors, at which David Owen was present, at which he let fly, and I had to defend myself.
Well, that's absolute nonsense. And I'd like to have evidence of that. I mean, firstly, I don't think I've ever met Mr. Mansell. So that's the first thing. If Foreign Secretary was going to interfere, I don't frankly think I would interfere at that level. I would have interfered with the chairman of the BBC, and I never did.
The policy of the Foreign Office was to be blindly supportive of the Shah. We couldn't do that. We had to reflect all shades of opinion, which we did, and that provoked a certain amount of reaction on the part of senior people in the Foreign Office who resented what we were doing. So we had a number of lunches at Bush House, at which senior people from the Foreign Office came and delivered their messages, and were very largely ignored.
By the end of 1978, Iran was in chaos, with the majority of people against the Shah. Hundreds had been killed in demonstrations, but the Shah was losing control.
I believed by then that, well, certainly by December, that the game was up, and that he was almost certainly going to go, and the only people who could make that choice and handle the situation were the Iranians themselves.
The Shah fled Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned to take power. Britain and Iran's relations entered a new phase of almost complete estrangement. The Shah would always blame the British for Khomeini's rise to power.
He was always suspicious of the British, and I think, to begin with some justification. You must remember that he'd seen at the age of 6 that his father had been put on the throne of Iran by the British. At the age of 21, he'd witnessed his father's removal from the throne of Iran by the British. And of course, in 1953, the British had collaborated with the Americans in removing Mossadegh from office. So he was keen to attribute to the British and the Americans, to the Western powers, if you wish, magical powers that simply didn't exist. The events within Iran, he would very largely have interpreted as the machinations of Western powers, which I think was quite wrong.
Even now, 30 years after the revolution, despite a generation of almost complete mutual isolation, the notion of the hidden hand of the British lingers on. Some people call it Uncle Napoleonism.
اون موقعی که من این رمان نوشتم همه مردم دیده بودن که امپریالیسم بریتانیا با اون عظمت و قدرت از بین رفته، در واقع به اصطلاح خودمون فارسی زبانا پشم پیلش ریخته بود و من تصور نمی کردم که یک همچین سرصدایی بکنه. منتها این آرزه که من به سبک گرفته بودمش و سنگین‌تر از اون بود که من گرفته بودم، بعد از انقلاب به خصوص دیدم که خیلی شدید و غلیظ وجود داشته و وجود داره. یه طبقه‌ای که عجیب و غریب به خلاف عقل و منطق تصور کرده بودن که من خواستم واقعا بگم که واقعیت داره، هر اتفاقی در مملکت میفته کار انگلیس هاست. به من میرسیدن بعد از تمجید و تحسین فراوان از کتاب، آفرین به شما، قبل از همه شما فهمیدید که هر اتفاقی در مملکت میفته کار انگلیس هاست. و من اصلا مثل اینکه دوش آب سرد رو سرم می‌ریختن. درست خلاف اون بود که من میخواستم برسونم.
خیلی ما تاریخی فکر میکنیم، تمام مدت سابقه همه چی رو نگاه میکنیم، این به این دلیل داره اتفاق میفته، اون به اون. قدیم هم همینطور بود، من فکر میکنم تا یه حدی. حتی محمد رضا شاه هم من فکر میکنم همین باور داشت، حتی مصدق هم همین باور داشت. میدونید یعنی رجال معاصر ما هم این تصور داشتن، ولی یه چیز خیلی عمیقی شده تو ذهنیت ایرانی.
It is very ironic that I'm English myself and I translated this novel into English, and many people have pointed this out to me, including Pesach himself. A very strange incident happened to me. I work as a professor of Persian, and there was a young lady I had been reading medieval Persian with, and she asked me if I would like to meet her father, who was visiting her, and he was a mullah, and she introduced me to her father as the man who translated my Uncle Napoleon. And he looked at me and he obviously thought, well, here's a fraud. And he said, you didn't translate my Uncle Napoleon. My Uncle Napoleon was written by the British Secret Service, and Iraj Pesisar translated it into Persian. You didn't do the English. And he was obviously convinced that this was true.
مشخصاً به نظر تو کی آقا رو مسموم کرده؟
والله آقا دروغ چرا؟ تا قبل ما خودمان به چشم خودمان چیزی ندیدیم، اما خاطرمون جمعه که انگلیسی ها آقا رو چیز خورش کردن.
خلاصه فرمودید بقیده مشقاسم امپراتوری انگلیس آقا رو مسموم کرده.
کی؟ امپراتوری انگلیس؟
Uncle Napoleonism may be less rife than it was, but a large number of Iranians are still tempted to point a finger at Britain whenever something goes wrong. When will these suspicions come to an end? I don't know. But as someone who lives between both cultures, the sooner the better.
خب انشالله به اسم صلح بین دو تا مملکت یه روبوسی بکنیم. خیلی ممنون از لطف شما.
The fallback view in Iran of the political world is always that what you see is not the truth. There's always something underneath it. This is very, very deep in the Iranian take on world politics. That if you believe what you're shown, then you're just being a naive fool.
این خدمتتونم باید عرض کنم که به محض اینکه این برنامه رو منتشر کنید، پخش کنید، از 1000 جا صدا بلند خواهد شد. دیدید نگفتم مال خودشونه.